Hello and welcome. I'm Brent Glass, Director Emeritus of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, and also Senior Advisor to the National History Academy, an innovative history education program for middle school students and high school students with an emphasis on the power of place and the importance of understanding American history through historic sites that have had important impact on our country's history. Today, we're going to be visiting Harpers Ferry and discussing the role of John Brown and the role he played in shaping the years leading up to the Civil War. John Brown was a polarizing figure in American history. His raid on Harpers Ferry in support of the abolition of slavery and his capture and execution was a defining moment as the country moved toward disunion and civil war. During this virtual tour of Harpers Ferry National Historic Park, we will reflect on the different contemporary perspectives on Brown's raid. And we're going to do this with retired National Park Service historian Dennis Frye and National History Academy President Bill Sellers. Following the tour, we will conduct a live Q&A discussion to explore why this event is such a great example of a discourse in civics. And I would just offer the editorial opinion that you need to understand American history to participate in the civic life of our country. And we need, in order to have a democracy, we need people who understand our country's history. So this civic season, this event is part of the first ever civic season, a new tradition, which runs from Juneteenth, which was last week, through July 4th. Hundreds of history and civic organizations nationwide have joined forces with the next generation to kickstart the civic season, a time to explore our complex past and springboard into the future. And you are invited to participate. There are 450 plus resources and activities. Whether you have 5 minutes or 2 hours, prefer a podcast or a live event, or taking a class. If you're interested in voting rights or social justice or immigrant stories or land and climate, the civic season has something for you. Learn more at www.thecivicseason.com or at Civic Season. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Bill Sellers and Dennis Frye.
Welcome. My name is Bill Sellers. I'm the president of National History Academy, operated by the Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area. We're very pleased today to be part of the civic season, the first year that the groups around the country are being brought together to encourage young people to get involved in our country in meaningful ways. And we started National History Academy 4 years ago, primarily directed at high school students. We've now added programs for middle school students, but with the idea that history is a resource for students to understand our own times. So, we've been recruiting students from all around the country. In 2018 and 2019, we had on-site programs. Last summer, we had an online program with over 650 students from all 50 states, 20 countries. And this summer, we've got some amazing online programs. some that we've developed in partnership with the Case Method Institute out of Harvard Business School, some workshops that we've developed with historic sites around the country. But we're looking forward to getting engaged with young people from throughout the country. We're hiring college students as teaching assistants, and we hire many young teachers earlier in their careers to get involved in the program. Today, we're incredibly honored to have Dennis Frye here with us. Dennis, for over 20 years, was the chief historian at the Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. I don't think anyone in the country knows more about Harpers Ferry than Dennis. He's written 11 books on the topic, including his most recent book, published about a year and a half ago, called Confluence. Harpers Ferry, as destiny. Okay, I will get that right. But Dennis, when I come to Harpers Ferry, and I you learn so many of the rich stories here. I mean, we're standing in front of the John Brown's headquarters. Just over my shoulder to the right is the Black Elks building, and over the course of the last 100 years, people from all over the country have come to this site. This place has a special meaning in American history, and it means something different to different generations. Just in the last year and a half, the meaning of John Brown and Harpers Ferry means something differently. It means something different to me now than it did before George Floyd was murdered. It means something different to me now before January 6th and the takeover of the United States Capitol. Why is Harpers Ferry such a meaningful place in American history?
Well, first of all, Harpers Ferry never loses relevance. As you indicate, events that occur today can be related to events that occurred at Harpers Ferry in the past. And what historians often see are not so much a cycle where history repeats itself, but where you see parallels, where you can see that this has occurred and this occurs today, and look at the similarities. And these similarities often are quite frightening, and sometimes they're quite encouraging and quite stimulating. But you can study these parallels, and it really gives you a sense of continuity of time. And so Harpers Ferry is part of that continuum, and it's easy to apply lessons that we learned in Harpers Ferry from generations ago to today. It's a living environment. Even though we talk about it as history, we present it as history, Harpers Ferry, with the lessons that it teaches, can be so applicable to the lessons we are trying to learn from our existence today.
So over the course of the next 30 minutes, 45 minutes, we're going to go down into the town of Harpers Ferry, to Storer College, to some of the significant sites in the town. But it all started here. What brought John Brown to this site in 1859?
Well, isn't it interesting? It's a log cabin. I mean, how many times in American history can we trace the beginning of something big to a log cabin? Here we are in the woods, in the mountains of rural Western Maryland, very isolated. You can hear the cicada. We are surrounded by the cicada chorus today because we're out in the middle of nowhere. And that's exactly the reason John Brown selects this building and this property. We are on a map about 5 miles north of Harpers Ferry. Harpers Ferry will become Brown's target, where he will launch his war against slavery. And I will refer to this bill not as John Brown's raid. Over and again, American history has spoken of this moment as John Brown's raid, but that is unfair. It's unfair to history, and it's unfair to Brown, it's unfair to America, and it's a mischaracterization. A raid gives you a sense of something temporary, of something tenuous, of something that just doesn't have much significance. It's not very important. What in the world is a raid? This is a war. Brown here plans to launch a war against the institution of slavery. Here, Brown intends to launch war to free human beings that are held in bondage. This is not a raid. The plans that occur here, the thinking that's happening here, is designed to change American culture, American thought, American law, and America's future. And so this log cabin is of import, and John Brown will transform history here and on his march to Harpers Ferry from here.
Well, and I think so much of what John Brown as a symbol means. Is he a terrorist? Is he a martyr? Is he a hero? Is he a villain? You know, how does America grapple with that meaning through the course of our history? Because I know he meant something different to the during Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era, during the Civil Rights Movement, and now today. It's all those. In many ways, he's all of those things. He's a contradiction.
Well, Brown means different things to different people. And even when we have discussions today with people about John Brown, and we ask the same question that you do, we do this on public tours at Harpers Ferry. We actually open it up and say, who is he? What is he? What does he mean to you? The diversity of responses we receive is extraordinary. The wonderful thing about Brown is that although he lived 160 years ago, and his actions were transformative in America over a century and a half ago, he continues to breathe into the soul of America. Americans, people living today, know something about John Brown. They understand something about him. And they grapple with who he is and what he meant to America. This is good because this discussion of Brown is really a discussion of civil disobedience or civil war. How far do you go? That's a question we need to ask. Brown detests slavery, hates slavery, and he hates anything associated with it, to the point where he believes that the only way to eliminate, to eradicate this horrible, horrible institution from this nation is with violence. So we must ask the question, how far do you go to make your belief reality? And what do you do if there are people in your way? And what if they don't believe as you believe? So this whole question of civil disobedience, objection, resistance, what's the line between that and then continuing on and above to the point where I am willing to kill. I am willing to go into violence to make my point known. You try to stop me, you're in my way, I will remove you so that I can complete my mission. And that's what Brown was different from abolitionists in this regard. Most abolitionists were practicing civil disobedience. They were objecting to slavery through their printed press, through the books that they wrote, through the pupils that they taught, through public events and public rallies, through public ceremonies and church services. This was the abolitionist's main weapon. But most abolitionists abhorred violence, rejected violence. Think more along the lines of the abolitionist and Martin Luther King. King did not want violence. He did not validate violence. He wanted to shun violence. He wanted peaceful resistance, the epitome of civil disobedience. Well, Brown went beyond that. Brown believed that the government would not support him, the Congress would not support him, the state legislatures and governors would not support him, and the courts and ultimately the Supreme Court would not support his belief. His belief being, we must eliminate slavery. So Brown went to a higher authority, higher than all of us. Brown went to his creator, God. And Brown says, and many times in this house did John Brown pray to his God over and again for direction. And his God had chosen him, according to Brown, to be God's instrument, God's weapon to destroy slavery in this country. And so for John Brown, if violence is necessary, violence is acceptable. And God gives him the moral authority to bring about an end to slavery through violence if required.
So it's October 1859. We're here at the headquarters. We're just about to go down to the lower town. How do we set up the next step of our trip here today?
Here, John Brown accumulates his army, and it is an army. Now, it's not a big army. It's going to be 21 men plus Brown, 22 total. But that's okay because The strategy is guerrilla warfare. We don't intend to take on standing armies. We don't intend to fight the army of the United States of America. We're not going to accept the assaults of the United States cavalry. We don't intend to engage United States Marines. No, 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 no. We're a guerrilla force. We're small, we're agile, we strike fast, and we're invisible. We get in, we get out, and we accomplish our mission. So Brown here has a group of young, dedicated, passionate missionaries, if you will, who are on this mission. They saw themselves this way. Who are on this mission to destroy slavery, to eliminate slavery. And they're all trained soldiers. These aren't just simply people that Brown picks up off the street. Many of them have fought with him in bloody Kansas 4 or 5 years earlier. All of them come to him through recommendations. And it's not just whites. Brown also recruits 5 African-American soldiers who will participate. One of them, whose wife and children still are enslaved in Virginia. And so here is where they plot. Here's where they plan. Here's where he brings his weapons, his rifles, pikes or spears that he's going to issue to those that he frees. Here's where he pulls his ammunition, his wagon. Everything is brought right here. Not very big place for an army of that size, but isolated, quiet, except when the cicada are singing. And Brown brings his daughter and daughter-in-law here to give a semblance of normalcy, to help protect him, to keep this mission secret. Everything is based on utmost secrecy. Nobody knows about this. Nobody knows the plan. Nobody knows where they're going to attack or when. Brown is literally in the midst of a population that has no idea that he is about to strike a blow against slavery. And where we are, this is slave territory. Maryland, Virginia are slave country. The Mason-Dixon line to our north is about 30 miles from here. Freedom is close. Brown knows that, and Brown intends to bring those he frees through this part of Maryland to Pennsylvania and beyond. And this is the brain trust. This is where he plans, organizes, and departs. His final words on October the 16th, Sunday, when he launches his war, his final words here from that porch, talking to his men, now standing in front with their shawls and their arms, their sharp rifles, are these: "Men, get on your arms. We shall proceed to the ferry."
Let's proceed to the ferry. So Dennis, we're here at the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac rivers. And this is one of the most beautiful places in the country. I love standing here, but there's a much deeper story here.
Well, we're not standing here because of beauty. We're not standing here because this is pretty. This is a point of invasion. And that's the word we need to use here. Brown and his men are invading Virginia. They didn't think of it as invasion. They think of it as an expedition for freedom. But if you're a Virginian living here in Harpers Ferry, remember, this is not West Virginia at the time. There's no such thing as West Virginia in John Brown's time. This is Virginia. Virginia is the largest slaveholding state in all of the states. So Brown's going to strike right at the heart of slavery. And he's coming across this river from Maryland. We've seen his hideaway, the Kennedy Farm, which is just a few miles to our north. This is where we have our advance headquarters. Well, now the advance is moving. And so on the night of Sunday, September the 16th, Brown and his men, 18 total with Brown, are going to cross this bridge. Now, obviously, this is a ruin of the bridge, but at the time, it's a covered wooden bridge. It's the only access point into and out of Harpers Ferry across the Potomac River. It's a railroad bridge, a wagon bridge, and a pedestrian bridge. But for John Brown and his men, this is now a bridge to freedom. Let's go find out what happens next.
So now, Dennis, I understand the town has changed since the time of John Brown.
Oh, yes, very much so. In fact, probably about 60% of the buildings that were here at the time of Brown in 1859 aren't here anymore. And much of this green space that you see here on this illustration was not green space. It was wall-to-wall buildings. It was a thriving industrial town. And today it looks like a national park. Well, it didn't look like a national park. It was not a national park. This is a place of war for John Brown. Now, we could see a couple of objective points here. The bridge that comes across the river is right here. This is the place where the historic bridge is. And you can see we're very close to that point. Now, what Brown and his men are going to do is go for two objectives. One of them is here, which is the location of the United States Arsenal. This is where the weapons are stored. This is a principal objective. Another objective is the armory, parallel to the Potomac River here, where you see all this green space. You need to take away every tree and replace it with roofs, and replace it with smokestacks, and replace it with windows, and replace it with brick structures. 600 yards of brick structures here. This is where they manufacture the weapons. So what Brown intends to do is seize the armory where they make the weapons, seize the arsenal here where they store the weapons. And ultimately his command post, where he's going to control everything, is from a fire engine house that serves the armory. Boy, that building was never built for this kind of fire. It was never built for a fire of war. It was built to put out fire that might be caused by passing locomotives or by errant sparks here in the armory buildings. But this soon is going to become the centerpiece of the John Brown War, and not as he expected.
So Brown and his men have crossed the river. They've now entered town. So what happens next?
Well, we need to remember that this is all done secretly. No one expects Brown. No one knows he's coming. This is literally a top secret mission, and the objective is right here, right where we're standing. This is what's called the Arsenal Square. And remember now, the arsenal by definition is a place where the weapons are stored. There are 100,000 weapons stored here, rifles and muskets. And in fact, we could see the outlines of one of the arsenal buildings. Now, the arsenals have been long gone. They were destroyed at the outbreak of the Civil War. But when Brown came here, we would not be able to see most of what you see here behind me, because this building is a two-story brick building that blocks the view. And there's a sister building that's even bigger here on the Arsenal Square where all these weapons are stored. Here's the thing, Bill. So it's about 11 o'clock at night, and Brown has scouted all this. He himself has been in the town. He's walked the streets. He's even conversed with people in Harpers Ferry. They don't know who he is. He comes here with an alias as Isaac Smith, and he actually just fits right in, blends right in. He's had an advanced spy here for over a year, John Cook, who's been gathering intelligence and information. They know when the armors come to work. They know the flow of the town. They know where people go, where people live. They've got an enormous amount of intelligence. All that works to their advantage. The reason they strike on a Sunday night, that's the day, the only day of the week that the armorers don't work is Sunday. So Brown's plan, get in, get out, take some weapons. He doesn't need 100,000. He only needs a few thousand. Get them out of here, and nobody even knows. So we are at the principal objective right here. Get those guns, get out of here. And you know, it's working. It's working. It's now about midnight. Brown has seized the arsenal. He's taken the armory itself. How did he do that?
How did he do that? I mean, it must have, so he had a surgical plan. He wanted to get in, just spend 2 or 3 hours in town, and then get back across the same bridge he entered town.
Yeah, it was not in his interest to linger. It was not in his interest to stay here. It certainly wasn't in his interest to get captured here or trapped here. And so let's get in, grab, and get out. I mean, we're going to conduct the war. This is the beginning of the war, not the end. And so we need weapons for that war. We'll get those weapons. Yes, we are striking the United States military. These are U.S. military weapons. And that means we are striking the United States government. This is an attack against government property. We're standing on government soil in 1859, just as we are today in a national park, standing on U.S. government soil. So this is public property. Well, Brown considers public property now his property. I'm just going to take some. I'm just going to apprehend some. I just will possess some of that, because Brown intends to use this public property to bring about his public goal, which is the termination of slavery.
So did Brown have an idea of what his actions represented as he was coming into Harpers Ferry?
Oh, he knew exactly what the consequences would be. But for his consequences, for his war to succeed, it can't end here. This is the beginning, not the termination. And that's where things go wrong. Let's go find out what happens next.
So Dennis, everything's going well. Brown has seized the armory, he seized the arsenal, and then everything starts to unravel. What happens?
Well, it begins to unravel with two shots that probably shouldn't have been fired, very near to where we're standing. Now, right now, we're standing in front of the fire engine house of the United States Armory, the fire engine house, all right? Brown has made this his headquarters, Grand Central Station, while he's here. This is his center of communications. Everybody knows this is where you can come and where you can leave to get instructions. And so the building soon will become known as John Brown's Fort. But for history's purposes, in October 1859, it's the fire engine house. But two shots are going to be fired very near this building. Those two shots are fired at a free African American who is at work. Hayward Shepard is an assistant baggage master for the Winchester and Potomac Railroad, which is a sister railroad of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. They're expecting the express train to be coming in from Wheeling, heading towards Baltimore, arriving around 1:30 Monday morning. Brown knows this. Remember, he scouted the town. He knows all the schedules. He knows the routine. Now, the idea is train comes in, passengers get off, passengers get on, train leaves. Nobody knows John Brown and his men are in town. Nobody knows that we've just launched a war because the train and the railroad have nothing to do with it. Well, they make a mistake, Brown's men. The night watchman on the bridge escapes and starts running towards the railroad station and the incoming eastbound train. And the train stops. And it doesn't continue. Hayward Shepard is curious. And he walks out on the platform and he's silhouetted in the locomotive light. And he sees two men on that Monday morning at 1:30, quarter or 2 in the morning, with rifles. And it startles him, it stuns him. People aren't walking around Harpers Ferry with weapons. And he begins to move the other direction. He knows he's been seen. And all of a sudden, the night air, halt! And it frightens him. And he's thinking very quickly, safety, 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 train, go to the train, go to the train. So he's running towards the train. You can see his figure silhouetted in the light. Halt! Again. And he just moves faster. The adrenaline is pumping. I got to get out of here. So two of Brown's men raise their weapons and fire. And Shepard goes down. And he's going to be mortally wounded. Several problems here. One, those shots are going to be heard. There's nothing quiet. There's no silencers at the time of John Brown. They're going to be heard that night, and they echo off the mountain. And two, a man has been mortally wounded, a free African American, who ultimately will die. And the irony, the great irony of this is, the first man to die in Brown's war to free African Americans from bondage is himself a free African American. Well, this is going to start the problem. Eventually, that train is permitted to go forward. And of course, the word gets out that Harpers Ferry has been seized by abolitionists, and that we have a war here commencing in Harpers Ferry, and that they hold the federal buildings, the Armory and the Arsenal. As a result, United States troops are sent here by the President of the United States, U.S. Marines, and they arrive soon, and their target is going to be John Brown's Fort. Let's go check it out.
So the United States troops arrive. U.S. Marines, is that right?
Yeah, U.S. Marines. They're coming from the Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. They arrive here via train. Here's an interesting revolution. Now, this is the revolution we're talking about, a revolution to end slavery. But it used to take 3.5 days to come from Washington to Harpers Ferry via traditional transportation. 3.5 hours by train. 3.5 hours by train. Brown didn't count upon that. And ultimately, he gets trapped in here. Now, he's trapped by local Virginia militia, surrounded. But this is a job for professional soldiers, the U.S. Marines. And the ultimate consummate professional is Robert Edward Lee. At this time, a Lieutenant Colonel, R.E. Lee, wearing the United States Army blue uniform, working for the United States Army, just recently the superintendent at West Point, that Robert E. Lee. You might recognize his name, not as a United States soldier. Well, he's in charge of the Marines. Now, Lee never was a Marine. He was regular Army his whole career. up until the Civil War. But he's in charge. He's got command presence. He's had field experience. The president has him placed in charge. And so here's what we need to do. These doors are barricaded. And Brown and his men, it's still dark when the Marines arrive. It's now Tuesday morning. The raid is about 36 hours old, this war. Brown, who started with 18 men, is now down to 4 and himself. Others have been killed or captured or terribly wounded. So he's only got 4, but he's got hostages in here, Bill. Hostages. We have 11 leading citizens, all men, all white, who have been seized that are inside this building. Some of them are the highest officials, highest ranking officials of the United States Army. And so this is a problem for Lee and the Marines. I mean, if he just attacks, somebody may get hurt that they don't want to harm. If they just open fire and they have stray bullets, again, harm may come to some civilian that they don't wish to harm. And so the combatants are Brown and his men. We have to target the combatants. So how do we do that? This is where it gets interesting. So they attempt a negotiation. Jeb Stewart, James Ewell Brown Stewart, a young lieutenant at that time in the cavalry, arrives with Lee and is sent up here by Lee to negotiate. Brown says, here's my deal. You let me and my hostages go. I will not harm them.
So Dennis, what is Lee's plan? He doesn't want to hurt the non-combatants. What is his plan?
Well, again, we've had a negotiation that failed. Brown insists that he and his hostages be permitted to leave. That's not acceptable. And so Stewart gives a signal, and the signal is to attack. Stewart will step aside and literally raise his hat in the air and wave it, and that is a sign for the Marines to attack. Now, it is right between dawn and early light. Right? It's pretty dark. First thing the Marines do is they grab a sledgehammer, and they get down low because Brown and his men have portholes through these doors. They can fire at us. It's very dangerous out there. If you're out here in front of this building, you're going to get shot. And we've already had 4 civilians killed here in Harpers Ferry, 4 civilians. And so they're down low with a sledgehammer, 3 Marines, and they start striking against the door. Now, Brown has barricaded the doors on the inside with fire engines, very heavy pieces of machinery. They don't budge. That doesn't succeed. Well, since it's a firehouse, they find a ladder. So the idea is let's put Marines on the ladder, and we'll use the ladder as a battering ram. And so a dozen Marines are placed on a ladder, and again, it's very dangerous out front here. I mean, they can fire right at you. And so the Marines tentatively, it's pretty tentative and tenuous about, they're coming around low with this fire engine ladder to strike this building, and they go forward, they drive forward, and they hit the door, bam! Nothing happens. The fire truck that's in there holds. Not a single Marine has been shot yet. So we're going to try again. This time, the Marines are going to be more bold about it. They're going to put more pressure, more force, and drive in on this thing, regardless of how many bullets might be flying. So they stay low, they're in front, and they drive forward, and bam! And they hit the door. And again, they don't swing the door open. But where the sledgehammer had been working, they had weakened the wood, the frame of the door. And they put a hole in the door big enough for 1 person at a time to crawl through. 1 person, Bill. So the lead Marine with his saber is Lieutenant Israel Green. And what you would see early that morning, if you could see, and there were spectators, some report as many as 2,000 spectators had gathered to see this culmination of this assault. 2,000 people. You'd see Green going through the hole head first, everything else trailing. Let's go inside.
So we're inside the firehouse, John Brown's fort. What happens now?
Well, let me come back up here to the door. So remember, there's a large fire engine right here. Now these are not fire engines. These are just hose carts. I mean, these are big pumpers, massive, weighing probably several thousand pounds with water in them. And so that's what's here. You got to remember a large fire engine here. It's not all this open space. It's very tight. The hostages are lined up along the back wall. And Brown is probably, we don't know exactly, but probably located right about here between the 2 fire engines. And so the hole here has been penetrated, and Green head first and he can't just stand up. There's a fire engine here. And so with his sword, his saber, he has to crawl on the floor under the fire engine and ultimately comes up in the middle of the room. And one of the hostages points and says, "This is Osawatomie." Osawatomie was Brown's nickname from Kansas. And so Greene, we don't know if he knows who Osawatomie is. We certainly don't know if he even knows how to say the word. But we do know he sees a combatant. And so right here, Brown apparently is turning, realizing that someone, an enemy soldier, has entered his premises in the building. Brown apparently is turning, and as he's turning, Greene is thrusting. Greene is thrusting his sword right into Brown's gut, right here. And Brown goes down. Greene looks at his sword. Not a drop of blood on his sword. No blood. It didn't penetrate, in fact. Instead, the sword apparently struck either a breastplate, a metal breastplate that Brown was wearing, or a belt buckle, we're not quite sure which, and deflected off of Brown. He hit him hard enough to knock him out, knock the air out of him, put him on the ground. But the sword literally became a sickle. It bent over. And Greene is, well, he's probably saying, "I've never seen that happen before." But he's got enough about him that he starts to beat Brown over the head with the hilt of the sword, just beating him. And he knocks Brown unconscious. Brown's a bloody pulp. He's alive, but he's just a bloody mass right here on the ground. In the meantime, oh, incidentally, John Brown would tell you that wasn't a breastplate. That was the hand of God. The hand of God stopped that blade. It wasn't my time. I have work to do.
So the building's surrounded. Brown is unconscious. What happens now?
Well, the Marines are successful in their assault. And as you mentioned, Brown is literally unconscious on the floor. Now, the first thing that happens is they bring the hostages out, and not a single hostage is harmed. Brown's men could have done great harm to the hostages. They didn't. They didn't. So none of the civilians are harmed. Lee's successful because none of the civilians are harmed, and he's taken his object. Remember now, there are nearly 2,000 civilians that are here that morning, in addition to almost 500 militia that are coming from various parts of Virginia and as far away as Baltimore, who have just witnessed this scene. And for the first time in 36 hours, Harpers Ferry is very quiet, very, very quiet. And so they start bringing people out that have been mortally wounded or are dead. One of John Brown's sons, Oliver, dead, dragged out of the building. Another son, Watson, dead, dragged out. And eventually, Isaac Smith is hauled out of the building. Isaac Smith, alias for John Brown. And the crowd, people recognized this person. People said, wait a minute. I've seen him. I've spoken with him. I've done transactions with him. He's the leader? What has just happened? How did this happen and we didn't know about this? And there's this sense of terror that grips the people of Harpers Ferry and Virginia and the South, that an invasion like this, a war could be launched on the ground of the South, and they had no idea it was coming. And they had no idea that the soldiers of this war to end slavery were living amongst them.
How long did it take for word to get out that John Brown had raided Harpers Ferry?
Oh, it's very quick with the telegraph. Now Brown had cut local telegraph lines, but very quickly it was discovered who he was, and he admitted who he was. He will recover. He's taken to a building adjacent to this, and he soon will be interviewed by Lee and various politicians. And he will fully admit who he is, why he is here, and state very, very forcibly that I am here to end this scourge of slavery. I am God's child. God has brought me here to bring an end to this evil. And this is not the end. I am not the end. You may have captured me. You may hold me. You may execute me. But this is not the end. We are launching a war, and we have just started.
John Brown has dedicated his life to the abolition of slavery, and he chose Harpers Ferry. What was his plan here?
Well, it's not just the abolition of slavery. Let me use a stronger word, the extermination of slavery. There's a difference between Brown and many abolitionists. And that principal difference is that all of them would like to see slavery go away, but how do we make it go away? What process should we use to eradicate slavery? And Brown's process becomes war, that we must go to war. So this is the launch pad. What you see here, this is where this war will commence. Brown intends to use the infrastructure of the Underground Railroad, to improve it. And his form of improvement is armed soldiers along the way protecting you as you move in this migration from slave territory to the land of free. But there's something else that's part of Brown's plan. Again, this is so offensive and obnoxious to think that a human being, we can put a price. We can put a price tag on a human being. You can't think of this person as a person. We must think of him or her as property. And in fact, it is just so painful to even do this. It just hurts. It's hard to even acknowledge that it's a him or her. By definition of law, a slave is it. Property. Value. 18-year-old slave, male, in 1859, who has the great misfortune of going onto an auction block to be sold as property. The value of that slave at auction could be up to $1,600. Now you might say $1,600. Well, that doesn't sound like too much value. That doesn't sound like a whole lot of money. Well, don't think of 2021 money. We've had inflation. And so I'd like for you to think of it this way. The average American at the time of John Brown, their annual wage is $300 a year. $300 a year. So consider how long it would take an individual to save to buy just one slave. So Brown thinks that he can economically destroy slavery, because if you invest in property that is volatile, if you invest in property that is not stable, meaning that the property has legs and arms and can move and leave and depart, that $1,800 just gone. So if you're a plantation owner that owns, let's say, 50 slaves, and let's just make it simple. Let's say that the average value is $1,000 per enslaved person, $50,000. You have more value in your slave property than in your mansion. You have more value in your slave property than in all of your crops. There's more value in your slave property than all the land that you own, thousands of acres perhaps. And if that $50,000 one evening is met by some of John Brown's guerrilla soldiers who say, "Come with me, we will lead you to and protect you until we get you to freedom," and 50 slaves leave that night, that's $50,000 that you have just lost, just gone. And you know what that slave owner is called? Bankrupt. Brown's grand strategy is economic warfare to make investment in slave property so unstable that it doesn't make sense to own slave property. Plus, he intends through instability to depress the value of slaves, which is a huge loss in what it might be as stable property and what it becomes when it's unstable. And so the grand scheme is we're going to lead people to freedom in migration after migration and protect them along the way. But as we do so, we are economically devaluing the property itself, and that will destroy the slave system and the slave culture.
So Dennis, we're here in Harpers Ferry to talk about Civil War and civil disobedience in a time in our country where those topics are incredibly relevant to what's going on. In the 1850s, we talk about how divided we are as a people today. In the 1850s, the country was really falling apart. Can you tell us about why this place is so important?
George Washington will select Harpers Ferry himself as a location of an armory and an arsenal, a place to manufacture weapons for the defense of the United States. And then fast forward a half a century to the 1850s, and the weapons that are manufactured here, almost 600,000 weapons produced in a 60-year period. Weapons here are what attract John Brown and his war against slavery to launch here at Harpers Ferry. Ultimately, Brown realizes that talk's not going to change the institution of slavery. Debate is not going to eliminate slavery. That civil disobedience, no matter how much we resist, no matter how many people we try to run away from the institution via the Underground Railroad, we've got 4 million human beings that are bound, that are enslaved, that are considered pieces of property. And it so offends Brown that he determines that the law of the land is unjust and that it should be discarded, that it's much more important that he follow a moral law established by God. And by his definition, God's moral law supplants, usurps human law, meaning the U.S. Constitution and even the U.S. Supreme Court. And so with the Dred Scott decision in 1857, which in essence declared that the slave will always be a slave and that the African American will always be a subordinate species, language that is just dreadful to read and so embarrassing if you're a U.S. citizen today. But that was the Supreme Court of the United States. Brown at that point says, it's hopeless. I can't depend on the government. We won't stand by the Declaration of Independence. We're going to war. And I'm going to go to war against slavery. And I'm going to choose Harpers Ferry as my first target because I need weapons. And Harpers Ferry is a repository of weapons. That's why we're here, Bill. We've decided civil disobedience isn't going to work. That talk and chats and communications and books and printed media, no, that's not enough. That's not going to stop it. That's not going to end it. The only way I can end it is with God helping me, and let's go to war.
So John Brown was arrested down by the fire station, down the lower town, and is taken to Charlestown for trial. Tell us about that.
Well, Brown indeed will be placed on trial here in Jefferson County Circuit Court. He's going to be tried for murder. Citizens will be killed, including the town's mayor. Treason. Brown actually had his own constitution established, known as the Chatham Constitution. And this was discovered. And so he will be charged with treason against the United States for wanting to establish his own government within the United States. And then finally, and obviously, he's going to be charged with slave insurrection, slave rebellion. Brown will argue that he's not guilty. The trial will occur, it lasts about a week. There'll be several dozen witnesses. Many of them were participants in the actual event. And very quickly, the jury will determine that Brown is guilty. It'll deliberate for 45 minutes. And it's a jury of all white males. Quite a number of them are slave owners themselves. Jefferson County's in Virginia. We have several thousand slaves that live here in Virginia, in this part of the state. And so he will be found guilty of all three: murder, treason and inciting slave insurrection. And Judge Richard Parker, himself a slave owner, a large slave owner, will determine that the answer to John Brown is the noose. And so Brown will be executed on December the 2nd, 1859, 6 weeks after his capture. He will be executed in Charlestown. And John Brown's final words resonated throughout the nation, but he didn't speak them, he wrote them. Before he was taken to the gallows, while he was in jail, he wrote his final note, and he handed it to his jailer, who he had befriended. And after the execution, the jailer remembered that he had this piece of paper, and he pulled it out of his frock coat, and he opened it, and for the first time, Brown's final words were read. And this is what it said: I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. So Brown prophesizes war. He had launched war, and it didn't end with his execution. And the United States accelerated towards the divided states of America. And of course, with the election of Lincoln and the first Republican president, and 1860 brought the first Republican majority in the House, Southerners felt that the abolitionists had taken control of the government. And so that led to secession, which of course leads to eruption of civil war in April of 1861. So Brown's prediction becomes real. I think one of the best ways to understand, to purge this land of blood, is that only a few miles north of Harpers Ferry, almost 2 years into the Civil War, a battle will occur in western Maryland at a place called Sharpsburg along the Antietam Creek. In 12 hours, Americans from the north and from the south will slaughter each other in 12 hours to the tune of almost 24,000 casualties. The bloodiest day in American history. And that happened within earshot of where John Brown launches his war at Harpers Ferry. So ultimately, Brown succeeds. You have to ask yourself the question, did he fail at Harpers Ferry, or ultimately did he have success? And you have to ask yourself the question, when is violence appropriate? When is violence, if ever, right? When should anyone use violence to necessitate, formulate, bring about change? Ask yourself that question. Brown did, and Brown asked the country that question. So here we have a physical embodiment of the outcome of the Civil War. Now, this building, as you see it today, was not here, but this is the principal building of Storer College. Storer College came into existence here in Harpers Ferry in the aftermath of the Civil War. And although it was established by charter as an integrated school for both boys and girls and for both white and black, it principally became a school for African Americans as a result of enforced segregation and Jim Crow laws. And so for almost 90 years, many former slaves attended Storer College, where they received their education. And in fact, this became so symbolic that two of the leading African Americans in all of American history came here, Bill, came to where we are to either commemorate John Brown or to launch a new revolution for rights, equal rights, civil rights for the African American. You're going to recognize these two names. Frederick Douglass comes here to commemorate and celebrate Brown in a very famous speech that he delivers on these grounds. Fast forward 25 years, the Second Niagara Convention meets here in 1906, led by W.E.B. Du Bois. he will literally issue a proclamation for civil rights 50 years before Martin Luther King. That is a clarion call to the people of the United States to respect all of us as equals. Here we demonstrate America's failures. Here we recognize America's flaws. And here we acknowledge Americans attempting to improve who we are and to change who we are and to transform into what Jefferson in the Declaration wanted us to be. And so Harpers Ferry is this place of constant transformation as America is growing from a small child into adulthood.
Thank you so much for everything today, Dennis. This is an incredible story. It's an incredible place. Also, thank you for everyone who's been able to watch today. And I know this will be available on video, but it's a great honor for the Journey Through Hallowed Ground and National History Academy to be part of Civic Season as we're trying to impact more people around the country and get them engaged in what's going on in America, understanding our present by studying our past. So thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for watching the video. Dennis and I filmed that last week, and it's actually the first time that Dennis and I have seen that. But Dennis, I think about John Brown and his meaning, the mythology of John Brown over time, and how he's how he's changed. One of my favorite articles that you've written is the one that you wrote about the Centennial celebration of John Brown in 1959, and how how history is treated, how history is interpreted, how history is sometimes hidden. Could you talk a little bit about why you chose to write about the Centennial of John Brown and how that might be pertinent to some of the reassessment of history today?
Well, keep in mind that 1959, 1960, 1961, as we approach the 100th anniversary of Brown and the coming of Civil War, the country is in the midst of the civil rights movement. And civil rights has come to the forefront, very much visible on television screens and brought into people's living rooms. And so civil rights is a point of discussion. It's a point of controversy. It's a point of debate.